Thank you. Um, Thank you, Nancy, and thank you all, Adnan and Andrew, for inviting me here. Like Nancy pointed out, it's childhood memories for me in coming back up to Kingston. But also it gives me a chance to share my work in progress and what's better for us, more fun for us to do than to share what we've been working on. And I've been working on this particular project now for over 10 years. And as Nancy said, the title of the larger project is Raleigh and the Origins of English Colonialism, but it's not a biography of Raleigh, it's really about English colonialism. And it just happens that Sir Walter Raleigh was involved in all the major colonial enterprises that England engaged in the late 16th century. So I look at the network of peoples, peoples he sends to colonize, the indigenous peoples he works with, his relations. He's really got his hands in the pie all over the place. So for instance, in Ireland, he is the single largest colonizer in the late 16th century. And I'm trying to put these overlapping enterprises together. And the questions or basically shaping the study is, what were the historic precedents in England for colonization in this late 16th century? And what did Elizabethans hope to accomplish by colonizing overseas? What did they actually then do in the first stages? And how did their thoughts change from these early activities to prepare the way for the larger colonization that would take place in the 17th century? So it's very much an interest in these early stages. And today, what I'm going to focus on is how the English conceived of assimilating or not assimilating the indigenous peoples in different places into their colonial enterprise. And personally, I think this theme of the beginnings of colonization here in the 16th century pretty much defined the parameters of English colonization in the coming centuries. And I think the thoughts that were developed are actually still with us today in various ways. So what I want to start with is to talk about the English in Ireland. The English did colonize other places outside of England. If we go back into the Middle Ages, and of course English conceptions of their own history under King Arthur is that they were basically everywhere. So they already did have a sense of being overseas. I remember when I read portions of Richard Hakluyt's multi-volume works that were produced in the late 16th, early 17th century about English overseas expansion, I thought, well, this is crazy. What's he talking about? How can he have so many volumes on things that didn't exist? And a lot of this was mythology. But the mythology was very important to the English, that they were a colonizing people and in fact had been colonized. That's very important as well. The Norman conquest of 1066 is very important in English conceptualization of who they are and what colonization can accomplish. And I find that fascinating, that it lasts for so many centuries. The Norman conquest of England, as I mentioned, 1066, and then there's the conquest that takes place of Wales, and of course, Ireland then comes along as a place to be conquered in the end of the 12th century, by the 1170s. And it is with the conquest of Ireland, as opposed to England being in France, for instance, later on, that I think the conceptualizations of how do indigenous peoples fit into an English colony take off. And in particular, by a little over a century later, the Irish Parliament, which is largely made up of Anglo-Irish, later to be called in the Elizabethan period the Old English, began passing laws to try to keep their people English. And by the next century, This becomes more systematized in 1366 with the Statutes of Kilkenny. And this was, again, a more systematic way of trying to prevent the English from becoming Irish when they moved to Ireland. And so these laws, for instance, forbade English from speaking Gaelic. English could not keep Irish entertainers. They could not wear Irish clothes. It actually outlawed English riding horses in an Irish manner. As one fellow would later note, it is unnatural that any people should love another's language more than their own. So that's part of the fear of English learning Gaelic, is that they will sympathize with the Irish much too much. The Irish lords, or I should say the Anglo-Irish lords, who are not over all of Ireland, but particular parts during the medieval period, kept Irish entertainers despite these laws, spoke Gaelic as their first language, English as their second. We often forget, by the way, through these centuries, the Irish elites, the higher nobility, go to the English court. So there's a lot of familiarity between England and Ireland through these centuries. And even at court, they often came dressed. They were proud of their adaptation of Irish culture. So by the 15th century, none of this is working, and so this is when the Pale is built. The series of dikes and ditches, largely around the environs of Dublin, which was meant to keep the English in and keep the Irish out. In a lot of places, there was no place even to cross. I mean, so it really is a way to isolate the English because of the same complaint that English are becoming Irish. The key for English policymakers in trying to transform the Irish, not just keep the English, but to transform the Irish, was to transform Irish culture. In some ways, that will mean even things like, if you saw the poster, this is a late 16th century poster, changing the Irish hairstyles. These are actually soldiers, curd and gallows glass, to get the Irish to give up their roaming. Roaming's the common word that's used for the Irish following their cattle different places. And in the medieval period through the centuries, the English have now turned to fencing in their land, and they will see this as the essential marker of colonization. If the Irish will just fence in their land, stay in one place, they won't be roaming around and getting into trouble. The idea was, because they're following their cattle, that they need grain and other things to live on, and so then they raid the stable Irish who are living on plots of land. And so the question is about how to end crime, how to end thievery. And so this, through the centuries, becomes the hope of the English, of how do we get the Irish to stay in one place? And I think if you know early American history, and actually several centuries of it, it's one of the aspects of early colonial America all the way into the late 19th century is how to get Indians, American Indians, to stop following, whether it was the buffalo, the deer, or whatever, and stay in one place. So it's one of the themes that has existed for centuries as a mark of civility for the English. So the English build the Pale, and most of you probably heard the saying, beyond the pale of civilization. You know, that's where the savages, the barbarians live, and this comes from Ireland. It's then, even in East Europe, there's a Pale that's built, and it's named for the Irish Pale as well. So fencing and planting becomes the mantra of the English for what they would like the Irish to do. Fence your land, plant it, and manure it Well, how do you manure it? You have to keep your cattle in one place. And it's amazing to me the obsession with manuring that comes along in the late 16th century. When the English are going to America, it's one of the things that several different colonizers talk about, that the key will be manure. And they will even stop in different islands in the West Indies hoping to obtain manure. And if this sounds obsessive, it was, because it's symbolic. So that when many of the Europeans come to North America, they will see indigenous fields of grain, particularly of corn, of maize, and they will act as if they don't exist. And they will say, we can increase the yields because we're going to bring cattle and we'll have manure from that cattle. So manure, cattle in one place, and fencing becomes the mantra in early America of the English, that this is what they're doing to the landscape, and also that it gives them a right to the landscape, because the indigenous peoples are not using their land properly because they're not putting forth labor to do so. Anyway, what happens in Ireland is there's two wars in 1570s, 1580s called the Desmond Wars. And we usually think of these as wars of England versus Ireland, but in many ways they're wars of England versus the Anglo-Irish elite. And it's part of the centralization of the Tudor state that's taking place back at home, and that the Tudors want to extend to Ireland as well. And under the Henrys, they had been talking about bringing Ireland into line, but little was actually done until under Elizabeth's reign. And part of the centralization was England decides they're going to get the Irish people on their side. And they're going to stop the abuses of the Anglo-Irish against the Irish. Because the Anglo-Irish own the largest states of land. They have the Gallay and the Kern, the soldiers, these private armies that exist. And those armies are put by the earls and others below them onto the people in the countryside. It's called coin and livery, who have to feed them and house them. And this was seen as very oppressive. And so the English think part of centralization will be reducing the power of the earls. We got to take away the armies by outlawing coin and livery. And then the Irish will support us because we'll tell them, here's how much tax you have to pay each year. You're not going to have these lords coming and demanding more whenever they want it. So the first Desmond War takes place, and the English use Sir Humphrey Gilbert to repress this war. This is in Munster province, the south eastern counties and in the central area. And he uses great brutality to do so. Basically, he goes to approximately 30 fortified areas, and he tells the people, you surrender, you get pardoned, you accept the Queen's sovereignty. She's who's over you, not your lord. If you don't, you get killed. And he actually takes people's heads, lines the tents, lines the pathways to his tents in order to impress on others. And Elizabeth rewards Gilbert. And she will give him the first patent to colonize North America. He'd been interested in overseas expansion. Actually, he was interested in the circumnavigation, but Drake got to it before he did. So he decides to colonize in North America. The first attempt is a massive failure. They barely get off the English coast, except for some of the ships that wind up in Ireland. Everything goes back to Ireland. And the Second Desmond War comes along in 1580, and it puts off colonization, but there are actually now many groups of people in England preparing to colonize in North America under Sir Humphrey Gilbert's patent. So it's all these people raising money, collecting supplies. So the actual plan was from Florida to Newfoundland, setting up a string of settlements under Sir Humphrey Gilbert's patent. All of these fall apart. They don't sail except for Gilbert. And I just want to briefly mention, well, what's he thinking about indigenous peoples? We don't know what he was thinking in 1578 with the first attempt, but with the second attempt, he does make a few mentions of the indigenous peoples, and he wants to amuse them. So he doesn't really have any plans. What he does bring is Morris dancers, hobby horses. If you've seen with the horse coming out front and back, and they dance with the part of the Morris dancing. He brings a lot of fripperies, toys, generally made by the Dutch. So he wants to amuse, and there's no real plan of what to do with the indigenous peoples. As many of you know, he winds up going to Newfoundland and claiming sovereignty over it for Queen Elizabeth. He dies on the way home, and the island is sort of forgotten except for the fishing. Nobody tries to claim it much until the early 17th century. But one of his associates, Sir George Peckham, decides almost as soon as he hears that Gilbert's dead, he prepares for a second expedition to America. And he publishes the first account by any English to recruit colonists and investors. So this is the first account a published account for overseas expansion. And what's fascinating about it, for me, well, it's many things. One is that it's an argument for genocide. Here, the English have basically not met any indigenous peoples except for less than a handful of Inuits who had been brought into London in the 1570s with the Frobisher expedition, and they died quickly. And we do have drawings of them. Bless you. And from the Frobisher expedition, there was some interaction with Inuits on Baffin Island. Otherwise, it's only what the English have been reading from Spanish accounts about indigenous peoples. So that's where most of their thinking is, specifically about Native Americans. And Peckham puts forth a pretty detailed argument of genocide, that the indigenous peoples of America, or the Americas, have no right to resist the English coming over, even to trade, to stay. Well, I don't have time to go through all of his arguments, but basically he says, if they don't accept us on our terms, and he uses the Old Testament as his rationale, we as a chosen people can just kill them all. He does mention we can enslave them too, but he doesn't dwell on the enslavement. He does mention that, but he's focusing on we can kill them all, and he cites all these biblical examples, and then he moves post-New Testament to the history of Christianization of other peoples to further the argument that eradication is approved by God. So they must accept us coming, and they must accept Christianity or else. I put that on the parameters of, it's about as extreme a view as you can get of colonization. I can't imagine anything more extreme than saying you can just go in and murder everybody. But what's fascinating to me is there are parameters. There's a range of views, and this is just one of them. And his attempt, by the way, fails. He doesn't get the support to go to America. And the Queen winds up turning over the patent from Humphrey Gilbert to his half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh. And Raleigh makes immediate plans to go to North America as well, but not to Newfoundland, and wants to go to a warmer climate and to what we now call Roanoke or Virginia. He sends over several expeditions. And I just want to mention a few things about his undertaking here, because unlike Peckham, well, Raleigh is a Hermeticist, and the people around him are mostly Hermeticist as well. This is a mystical Christian religious philosophy followed by Catholics and Protestants, specifically intellectuals throughout Europe. And one of the things the Hermeticists tend to believe is, first of all, the millennium is coming. It's coming soon, and it's connected to God revealing the existence of indigenous peoples in the Americas. Because, and this was one of the big questions after Columbus, is why did God all of a sudden reveal these people to us? Why didn't we know of their existence? Where did they come from? Are they descended from Adam, like everyone else, or is it a separate development? You see a movement towards deciding that they are descendants of Noah's sons, or one of their sons, his sons. But what's fascinating to me is that he and other Hermeticists think that there's actually much that Christians can learn from these indigenous peoples. That God has blessed them with an array of skills to prosper in the Americas. And by the way, I don't think it's just the Hermeticists thinking this way. One of the fascinating things I realized in reading Peckham's genocidal argument over and over is he actually makes small reference to people saying the English will have no right because the people who live there have rights. And I thought, again, they haven't met native peoples, and there are some people thinking that those people have rights to their land, that England just can't walk in and claim sovereignty. And if I had time, I would talk more about sovereignty, because I think that's an important issue in colonization. But Raleigh is one of these people who is directing others who work for him, or well, actually, I think they share with him these beliefs, that indigenous peoples are special. So God has endowed them with these gifts of especially the environment they live in, the bounty they live in, the emphasis on that they've been able to develop all these skills, that within a community they live in harmony, even if they have many wars with others, and that none of this occurred without giving them Christ. So there's something here that we can learn from these people. And I would put that at the other end of the continuum of a way to look at indigenous peoples at this time. And I think in some ways this is the origins of the noble savage philosophy that comes along much later in the late 17th century, especially in the 18th century when it's popularized. And by the way, when there again is a concern with what's the origins of American Indians. So the origins question remains important for this, what becomes a romanticization of indigenous Americans. So just a couple points. One is that the governor of the second expedition to America, Ralph Lane, was not a Hermeticist. He has almost no sympathy for indigenous peoples, and he winds up massacring some of the local peoples. The colony falls apart. It's followed up the following year. Raleigh sends a third colony now to be really the permanent colony. He sends farmers to it. But what's fascinating is that he chooses a painter to be governor. He chooses John White, his buddy, fellow Hermeticist who had painted the Indians. I mean, if you think about that in the history of colonization, who picks a painter to be a governor? So this is not meant to be a military enterprise. And the colony becomes the famed lost colony, but they actually weren't even supposed to be there because they knew relations were ruined. They were supposed to actually go up to the Chesapeake. But what happens, for one thing, is that war with Spain has broken out. And with that, the English basically forget about America because it becomes imperative now to colonize Ireland. And even from before the Second Desmond War took off, people in England were chafing at the bit to go colonize in Ireland. And when the Second War breaks out, you have people offering, I will bring 100 soldiers to go fight for the Queen in Ireland if you're going to give me land. But Elizabeth had held off granting land until she had all the ducks in a row. There was great planning taking place on how to colonize Ireland. Massive planning, as Nicholas Kenny has written about in his several books on the colonization under Elizabeth. Just massive planning on every level of how to do this. But with the Armada going in 1588, everything was being pushed up because of the English fear that Ireland would be a launching ground for attacking England. And so Elizabeth will send Raleigh as major colonizer to Ireland, many others as well. He gets the largest chunk of land, as I was alluding to earlier. And Raleigh was very different than his older half-brother, as in being a, let me just talk about some of the points of how he's colonizing. One is, even before he gets there, he sends one of his right-hand men to become sheriff in the counties he's going to have most of his land in, and tells him to end the violence there. Stop persecuting the Catholics, stop persecution of the ex-rebels, because the rebellion is over. And he will also send, as a significant portion of his colonists, he'll send English Catholics. And I think despite his reputation with some scholars that he's a radical Protestant, he's not at all, certainly not at this time. And in fact, he gives Catholic relatives and friends control of Catholic holy places to make sure they are preserved. And he works with local Irish and Anglo-Irish Catholics in his area. Now, you could say that he's just doing this because he's a smart colonizer. You can't colonize if violence is taking place. But for whatever reason, he's doing it, and he's planning all kinds of economic enterprises. This is an Atlantic project, and he's trying to connect Ireland to the Canary Islands and other places. He's going to be shipping staves all over the place, barrels. Opens up a humongous lumber industry, starts glass works, iron works. So he's really planning colonization in what we would think of as a mature fashion, mature economic fashion, which means he needs peace. And this takes me back to Elizabeth, because she gives us, I think, another view of what colonization could be and became. Elizabeth didn't agree with her favorite Raleigh so much on how to colonize Ireland. And when I say how to colonize, this is because, again, it's a different stage of colonization than the earlier stages. This is now the modernized stage. And her idea was Munster is empty of Irish. And in part, many had died in the Second Desmond War because the English, and they'll lose a lot of goodwill for this, decided to use famine as a way to fight. So even though they had won support, especially in the coastal towns, in the environs of the coastal towns, they used famine, which I believe, by the way, Humphrey Gilbert was the one who recommended the idea, because he had recommended to use this against Spain, by the way. But to cut down the wheat, starve the people as a way to win the war, and it works, ultimately. So for some reason, Elizabeth gets it in her head that all the Irish in Munster and all these provinces are gone. And somebody must have told her, well, maybe some fled and they'll come back. So she makes a rule that no English can employ an Irish. So what she's creating is exclusion. Well, that's her hope. All these directives that Irish cannot live on these lands, they cannot work on these lands, and it'll be for the English. But she's going to backtrack. Not on the employment issue, which the English just disregard, but she wanted to rationalize government, rationalize the legal system, create a system of justice and fairness. That was her concept of colonizing. And so, and she had done this previously, she had wound up pardoning many of the Anglo-Irish rebels. And some of these rebels had been rebels 3 and 4 times she pardoned them. So she decided, since they're pardoned, they get their land back. And it created a mess that lasted for 40 years or more in the Southeast, that now you had New English, as the new immigrants were called, saying, this is my land, and Anglo-Irish who had been pardoned saying, no, this is my land. And what's interesting to me is that the government sided with the Anglo-Irish, not with the people they had granted the land to, the English. And as I mentioned, this goes on long after she's dead, the disputes over these lands. But what is this about justice and fairness and all? And this is what I kind of wanted to bring up, of how I perceive of the gist of English colonization overseas that comes out of this period. And I would date it back to humanism, the rise of humanism in England, which is influencing Lord Burleigh, Elizabeth, and others in how they perceive of the state, of nations. And one of the ideas is that law must be supreme, but that equitable societies can be created. And what I want to use for closing is looking at someone who in Ireland is often viewed as almost Hitlerian, Edmund Spenser. And yet, I think if you read his work closely, is actually arguing for Elizabeth's version of creating a just society in Ireland. And how do you do this, and why should it be done? It's actually, I think, a very deep book. I didn't quite get it the first time I read it until I had actually started doing Irish research for years, on-the-ground research too, and looking at colonization, because he was a colonizer. So he had a lot of experience. He'd also been involved in the Second Desmond War as an assistant to Lord Grey, who was in charge of the whole thing for England. And he is often hated for a couple things. One is he recommends using famine in the future as a way to fight the Irish. The difference being, what he wants is sort of like with Sir Humphrey Gilbert, Irish who will swear sovereignty to the Queen will be protected. They'll set up garrison governments, basically. Their cattle will be protected, they will be protected and fed. It's the others, those who roam around, who don't claim protection, they're the ones that the famine's going to be used against. And he's also hated because he's arguing for the elimination of Irish culture. Even though there's parts he respects, and in fact he comes out and says, a lot of the things he's talking about getting rid of, he says there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's just he wants to create a society where everybody's the same. And in fact, although I do believe he is biased against the Irish, there's sometimes he can't help himself in what he says, but on the other hand, he says just the opposite. So intellectually, he'll say, first of all, the English are no better than the Irish. In fact, the Irish had education before we did. We were as savage as they were until the Norman conquest, so he's bringing the Norman conquest back in. It's the Normans who civilized England. They're the ones who taught us about the fencing and staying in one place and so on. So we can do the same thing with the Irish. And he argues against removal. He thinks it's wrong to remove the people from the land, so he's arguing against Elizabeth's view. And instead he calls for intermingling. That's the word he uses. We should intermingle, live with these people, so that we'll develop affections for one another. And he looks backwards to medieval England and says, you know, we need to have a community where all are responsible for each other, which is another reason why he doesn't like the roaming. It doesn't allow for the stable community. If you know anything about Protestantism in the early 17th century, especially in places like Puritan New England, but it's elsewhere too, and the Quakers do this as well, after meeting Sunday, people get together, you report on your neighbors. I saw Margaret and she was flirting with so-and-so, and she has to stand up in front of everybody else. This is the kind of society he's calling for. But he's calling for a just society, and fascinatingly, he says it's not all about law. He goes, you know what? Brehon law is fine. That's the Irish law. That's used. There's nothing inherently superior in English law either. And for him, what it's all about is staying in one place and giving people safety of themselves and their property. Again, to stop the roaming. Those are the thieves, the people roaming around. Get everybody to stay in one place, and English and Irish will live in peace with one another. So again, I find it fascinating that he's not condemning Irish culture on its own terms. Although again, I do see sometimes where he can't help himself in his references. But at least intellectually, he's saying we can build a just society as long as we all become alike. But he actually mentions, but doesn't mean we have to make them become Protestant. That's not the way to go about do things. So he's not a Protestant radical either. And this is the model used in colonial New England, again, with Native Americans. That if they cut their hair, they must change their clothes to English clothing, live in an English-style town. We call them the praying towns. So they must live and look like English. They must build fences. And he's laying this all out right here. And it goes back again to the 13th and 14th centuries. A lot of these ideas. So there's this continuity that comes along. So, you know, in summary, or just to conclude, I think the parameters that are laid out here are, we already see the parameters of what in the United States we call Indian removal. You know, the view that Indians and Europeans cannot live together, and the Indians must be moved off the land, which was Queen Elizabeth's idea. You move the people off and you isolate the English. We also see the noble savage mentality developed very early. But we also see the idea of assimilation. And I think it's fascinating today, at least looking at the United States, with some of the views of African American peoples, for instance, or indigenous Americans. What white folks are afraid of is when African Americans look different. And I don't mean skin color, I mean in how they dress. You'll see the complaints about baggy pants, you know, that they must fit in culturally. They must look like the white folks. Then we're not racist as long as they look like us and how they carry themselves. And as long as what's replaced the fencing is as long as they work hard. It's the Protestant work ethic. Don't complain, do your job. You see all this stuff in the 16th century in Spenser and other people's work. So I don't think that stuff's changed. that its appearance, it's a drive for conformity on certain levels, and culture is the level. And you see other people arguing just the opposite, arguing to celebrate diversity. Although sometimes I really wonder if they're celebrating diversity or they're just enlarging the parameters of conformity, but that's another issue. Anyway, I'll leave it at that and open for questions. So.
I want to thank Professor Gallay for a wonderful talk and opening up this whole fascinating subject of his new research, and open the floor on Ariel Saltzman, co-convener of the History Series this year. And I'd like to open up the floor to questions.
I'll take the plunge, and it's a little unfair, so I really enjoyed this. And you mentioned offhandedly that you see sovereignty as a big issue here, and as that's something I'm working on. I thought I'll be selfish and ask you if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah, the sovereignty. I was going to mention John Dee, and who was actually Elizabeth's magus. He's an Hermeticist and so on. But he's also in many ways an historian and a geographer. He's actually studied geography in the Netherlands. And what's important about John Dee is that when the English, before she grants Sir Humphrey Gilbert patent for America, she's worried about the legalities. Don't the Spanish have a superior claim to America through Columbus? And Dee draws up a series of papers to prove that her claim as a sovereign is superior to any other sovereign's claim. And it's fascinating material, including an extended essay, The Limits of the British Empire, and he even calls it British, not English Empire, the limits of the British Empire. And so the question becomes of sovereignty, and I think these are fascinating documents. Ken McMillan, who's at a Canadian university out west, I forget which one, has edited these, so they're easily available. And she's basically, he's basically gives her the legal right. She's so thrilled with the paper, she goes over to his house and thanks him personally that he's created these documents. And the sovereignty is, a lot of it goes back to King Arthur. And she's considered a direct descendant of King Arthur. And Arthur had sovereignty, according to Dee, over the kings of Western Europe. So in fact, don't tell the Scots this, the Scottish kings are actually vassals of the English king. And he starts going through, because by the way, he wants to stop any Scottish pretensions to America as well. It's not just the Spanish, it's the Scottish as well. He says all the northern countries, Norway, Sweden, they all owe sovereignty to Elizabeth. But, and what I realized in reading this, it's all about vassalage. And that's why the Indians will keep their land under Elizabeth. He doesn't need to describe that. Other kings will be vassals of her. So that's the sovereignty, and that's a different issue than land ownership. And so I think if you're looking for sovereignty, Dee's the place to go, because he lays out so many of the arguments of what sovereignty comprises, whereas ownership's really irrelevant. They're just vassals. It's just, yeah. Does that help? Yeah.
Thank you. It was a very interesting talk. I had two things I just wondered about. I can't help thinking about Thomas More's utopia with the whole egalitarian society, and that. So I was wondering if, how important, what kind of influence that might have had in some of these policies. That's the first question. The second one just relates to the wars in Ireland, and to what extent religion was imposed as well as I guess, sovereignty, swearing to the Queen. When in Ireland are starving out the Irish and things, did they force them to abandon Catholicism? Or?
I think the religious aspect, by the way, becomes much more important after she dies. And you have the Ulster in the north. That's when the colonization of the north takes place. And you have a massive amount of Protestants that are going to Ulster, whereas the immigration to the south wasn't as strong from England. And what happens is the Queen is offering tolerance. Some of the officials are offering tolerance, but basically it's a lot of the local Anglo-Irish, the New English I should call them, the New English officials who are trying to ram Protestantism down Catholic throats. But it's not that successful compared to what happens. Well, even in the north it's not so successful, but it's more violent, shall we say, the dispute, than it was under Elizabeth in the south. Because I think there were people, you know, like Spenser and Raleigh, who just weren't interested in pushing the religious aspect. They're colonizers, and their thinking is we need peace, actually. This place is a desert, so to speak. I mean, it's a rich desert, but a desert, in fact, that it needs cultivation. It's got this humongous, great collection of trees. This is before deforestation has taken place, and everybody recognized how valuable the trees are. It's got the single best salmon run in all of Europe, so the fishing is great. I've been doing a lot on the fishing and how that's important there too. So there's much more economic interest in, and in fact, they're bringing the Irish in that are in the countryside who aren't on the estates. When the 9 Years' War breaks out at the end of Elizabeth's reign, a lot of the Irish are siding with the English in the south, because the English are offering them protection for their cattle and themselves. And it's actually Irish from other parts of Ireland who are coming in. And so, you know, pushing religion was just not going to work at this time.
Right, Anna, and then Dawn.
I actually, just a follow-up question on Tennessee. I find this actually quite fascinating. I have no expertise in the subject, but that they were willing to use these famine policies to get these people to settle, right? But they weren't willing to use famine policies to get them to convert, right? Which suggests a prioritization of this kind of civilizing, economic civilization over religion. And I'm wondering, two reasons just occurred to me. One was that they just cared more about the sort of, as you say, proper exploitation of resources.
Mm-hmm.
And religion was sort of a side issue. Or that, I'm wondering if it's this sort of early tolerationist idea that, you know, to get people to change their religion would require a lot more violence than we're willing to invest. And are we just going to have to just let that one go in this service? So I'm wondering about that prioritization.
I would throw one other factor in, is that Elizabeth fears the radical Protestants herself. And in England, you know, it's been said by many historians, you know, she's head of the church, but she fears the radical Protestants much more than the Catholics. So I'm not sure she really wants to support some of the radical Protestant elements. And there's a lot of English elites who, and I think Spenser's one of them, if you read The Faerie Queene and his other work, it's kind of remarkable, you could say, how pro-Catholic he's using Catholic imagery throughout. There's anti-Irish stuff in here, but it's interesting. A lot of the lit scholars looking at this go, oh, you know, this is no radical Protestant. No radical Protestant would ever say these things. But especially things like celebration of iconography, saints, things like that. That if he's radical Protestant, it's not even on the table to be discussed. You know, so I'm wondering if that's a concern from Elizabeth in not pushing. But I think it's more the resources at the root. Let's get these resources. You know, iron was so important to the English. And they had plenty of it, but they hadn't turned to coal yet, of course, so they didn't have the natural resource. And Ireland had the iron and the wood. And so they'll develop a massive iron industry, and they start it right away until they use the wood up. It's not the iron that gets used up, it's the wood.
kind of hides a bit of a much nastier reality. I mean, you can't have people settle down until they give up holding land communally.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, give up a major thing, individualized property, the major resource of the time. You've got a social system based on communal ownership of the property. And giving up roaming is pretty much saying give up being Irish.
Hmm? Oh, in fact, Elizabeth, I didn't mention this part. One of the things Elizabeth said was, change your names. Give up the O and the Mac, because that is part of your rights as an Irish, your connection with a sept, with a family, clan, comes from your name, and gives you rights to the land itself. And so the Elizabethans say, you come in, we'll write you out an English-style deed to your land. So your claim goes to Elizabeth's sovereignty. It's not to that lord that gave you the land. So, yeah, there's a larger thing going on with changing the contours of land ownership to individuals getting pieces of paper in the English style.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like the Tudor surrender and regrant.
Right, surrender and regrant.
Which is the predecessor to all this.
Exactly. That's the basis for this. Surrender your land and we regrant it to you. So become English and own it as a family, but it's more like a small, a nuclear family rather than as part of a group. Yeah, and there's a lot of that going on.
I also really enjoyed the talk. I wondered, you discussed this very interesting, disturbing plan for genocide, or proposal for genocide, and discussed the sort of intellectual legitimation that went into it. Do we see any similar attempt with the famine? I was interested in, there are two instances in which we see famine being explicitly invoked as a tool to enforce submission. And is there any attempt, how is that justified, or how is it framed? Is there any attempt, is there any sense that they need to justify a policy of that nature?
Yeah, I didn't see, I don't remember a biblical justification for famine. And with Spenser, it is fascinating. In some ways, they're seeing it as a more humane way of warfare, believe it or not. That, at least under him, because, his idea, that the people are being offered protection and food. It's just if you reject, and no one ever gets a second chance. If you reject it, then we don't have to go out and kill you. We won't lose soldiers. You're just going to know what's going to happen. You're going to starve. And he actually goes through the details about how it's going to occur, the starvation, because he had witnessed it himself. And it's it is the most moving passage, by the way, in his prose work of view of the state of Ireland, because he describes the famine he saw. And he tells how terrible it is. But at the very end, then he says, but it was their own fault. So he goes back to, he adds that at the end. It was, if they'd only accepted the Queen's sovereignty, it wouldn't be there. But it is a moving passage if you ever get to see it. It's it's like a page long. It's really something. I'm sorry.
Andrew.
Thank you for the talk. It was great. What little I know about this topic is from the work of Nicholas Cannon. And, this seems a pretty different portrait of the process of the English invasion and colonization. He emphasizes extreme Protestants. And I'm just wondering if you could say more about that dialogue in your work with Cannon or revision. But then also one sort of more technical point or smaller point. He emphasizes very much the Roman precedent in the way that the English are talking about the conquest of the Irish, and that they will do to the Irish what the Romans had done to the Britons. And you talk a lot about the Norman precedent for the way they're thinking about this. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah, The Normans in particular, I mean, yeah, there's Roman references, there's Greek references, you know, from the educated in England and trying to understand colonization. But to me, what stands out are the Norman references. And what also stands out to me is that the Elizabethan and her elite consider themselves those people. They're Anglo-Normans. And the common people are not. They're not of that stock. So that fact, to me, gives a certain vibrancy to the Norman conquest as so much a part of their thinking, of who they are, and why they have a right to Ireland. It goes back to the Norman conquest. You know, now, as I mentioned, Dee will trace things back to Arthur as well. But to them, it's all the same line still, though. You know, so yeah, I don't see the Roman as important. You know, again, they talk about the Scythians. They talk about a lot of, you know, people in the classical world. But to me, it's the Normans that have the vibrancy. So, and what was the
about the dialogue with Canning, and the Roman point came from him too, because he really emphasizes that.
Yeah, I think his work's great. You know, I just see myself, those are just some refinements. My difference actually, although his work is dense, mine can get a little dense too, is in some ways I go down on, I have made a case study of the parts of the Munster province to get on the ground floor with actually how colonization took place. He's got even more than me on certain aspects of what the Elizabethans were thinking, but I decided to take from him and others that I read and then say, okay, let's see how it was applied. So I actually looked closely at how the land was transformed under Elizabeth from one group of people to another, and look at who these people are and how they're connected to one another. So to me, that's what I'm adding, is getting more of on the ground level, and then go back up to, let's get a larger look at what this means. But I think his work's great.
So we have two more questions.
Hi, yeah, I like your talk. I wonder if you could talk more about assimilation and the extent of what they considered assimilation. Because I think of later in the 17th century, and English have test acts and these kinds of things that, yes, you can be here, you can be in our society and operate, but they set limits on how much you can participate depending on how much you actually choose to inform. Are you going to become the right kind of Protestant? Are you going to stay Catholic? Are you going to be the wrong Protestant? In which case you can be here, but you can't actually participate in government. You don't have full rights to that extent. I wonder if do they set those same limitations when they're operating in Ireland or in the New World, where they are assimilating, but they're only letting you assimilate to a certain extent, like maybe just be there and work or something, but not actually climb up that ladder at all, or give you any kind of movement that maybe other people who conform more would get.
The macro on that, and this goes back again to Elizabeth, when she allows Gilbert to have the patent, the plan was that this would be mostly Catholics or half Catholic. And in other words, that there would be more tolerance and room for advancement outside of England than there would be in England. And for instance, she even says, you know, all the fines Catholics had, it didn't happen overnight, but she goes, first it was you have to pay your fines first, and finally, you know what, if you go to America, you could just pay us later. Just get out of America. You know, but the idea was you'll still be English. So I think there was, from the start, the idea of more tolerance, but Ireland's a different situation, I think. And I think it's because, you know, what you're going to in the 17th century, there developed such bitterness between Catholic and Protestant, especially coming out of the Cromwellian era and going into the late century, that lasts through, certainly into the late 18th century. There's still restrictions on Catholics in Ireland that are really severe. So I think demographics plays a role with Ireland being different than elsewhere. That the power of the Catholic Church then rises too, especially in the 19th century. So I think being so close to England and having such a large Catholic presence we wind up with different policies than elsewhere in what becomes the empire.
story in their
Mhm.
interests. And so one thing I'm wondering about why the Norman conquest might be of greater significance to them might be the policies of William the Conqueror with the Doomsday Book, going out,
Oh.
registering the land.
Registering
right?
every-
You know,
yeah.
so this seems to be the key concern that they have in how they're going to colonize, which is very different from how you could pattern it on Roman sorts of things, is that there's a successful sort of precedent and effort for breaking up Anglo-Saxon collective ownership, kinship structures, the other, and reformulating land tenure through the Doomsday Book survey and the imposition of feudalism. So one thing I'm interested in is this vassalage sort of notion that was part of sovereignty, but you were saying could be distinguished from land tenure and in terms of ownership.
Mhm.
And just maybe it seems there's an ancient sort of interest in this feudal sort of structure, but there's also something else going on in terms of individuals. So maybe you can
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how that's being kind of worked out.
I agree with you about the registration of land with the Domesday Book, that really speaks to surrender and regrant, although the difference is that the English haven't colonized all of Ireland, and so whereas in England, I think it's 93% of the land goes to the Normans.
Yeah.
It's not like that in Ireland. There's large parts of Ireland where the land remains in Irish hands. And I'm not talking just Anglo-Irish, I'm talking about Irish. So, but they do want this system that the Normans have brought over, this bureaucratic system. There's even an argument that, you know, in looking back at the Normans, that the reason for success was the king came, where he didn't go to Ireland, you know, or Elizabeth didn't move to Ireland. And that something has to be figured out with colonization of other places when you're not moving your sovereign there. And the whole question of vassalage, who's going to be in charge? And centuries had taught them that, you know what, maybe having earls and stuff in charge isn't a good idea. And so maybe you have to assign somebody who doesn't have that kind of status, and also the same kinds of connections with Ireland. You know, a Lord Lieutenant, and so on. So they wanted there was a suggestion Essex should go over, and he, you know, that you need somebody of great status that the Irish will respect, and not necessarily a lord, you know, one of their own earls. So I think that's why I do think there's a direct thought there. And the other part of your question was the, I'm sorry, huh?
The property issue, the separation of vassalage from property.
And its modernization. You know, on the one hand, the model here is medieval. So when they set up land grants to people, the idea is they're going to set up the elite court, all the old medieval privileges that go with landowning are that the English colonists are going to have. And it's not just here, they're still doing that in the late 17th century with the Carolina colony. They're setting, a lot of the colonizers are still working on the old medieval system of land ownership. And I actually write a bit about this in this book and also in other books, that the English were confused. They were confused about land, and it still exists to this present day. They had these medieval notions of how land was inherited or sold or parceled, and it wasn't working in the modern world. So they created all these legal fictions. And to me, it's fascinating because they're carried to America, they were carried to Ireland. Well, let me keep it for a second to the Irish part. So they come in with this idea they're going to rationalize the land system and use the English system, and it didn't work. They didn't have time to measure everything. Part of the English system, it has to be measured. So they used the Irish system. Even though they said we're going into Ireland to rationalize the system, they used the Irish system. And so you got a piece of land, you know, and the historians, including Kenny, do get this wrong. They think, oh, well, this person got 244 acres. No, it's only 244 acres of a certain type of land, and then they got another 1,000 acres that went with it. And the historians are missing that the English were granting in the Irish system. They're using these names of pieces of land which still exist. You know, I'd say 80, 90% of those land names still exist today to describe parcels, which we don't have in the United States. I imagine you don't have that same system in Canada either. But the old Irish system survived. And what fascinates me, that means that along the way, you know, I go to Jamie, you know, this land's actually mine. And he could go, well, where does it say it in your patent? And where does it say it in his patent? It doesn't. It's just really, it's the old Irish name we have to go by. We don't go by anything else, any drawing of the piece of land. It's just, you know what? This is Nakamudden. This is, and so that's the system they used, despite their claims that they were modernizing. So I think Elizabeth, and this was one of her big problems, was she wanted to subdue the earls, but she still relied on the old medieval system of having these great landowners because she figured they're the only ones who could really keep people in line. She's so into hierarchy. She raised the fewest people of any monarch from being gentry, or knighthood, let's say, into the nobility. She was so stuck on the importance of blood. And, you know, I think this is something she had to wrestle with, is trying to reduce these great earls, but she wasn't against class and hierarchy, and she worried about, well, who's going to be in charge? And I think that's why she pardoned so many of those Anglo-Irish leaders, because she was afraid there would be a vacuum of local leadership and it would get worse. So that's what I think the pardoning is all about. Because she's not pardoning the little guys, by the way. She's pardoning, and again, it's like 3, 4, 5 times. It's women too. You know, it's not just the men. It's, you know, females too. But they are, you know, they're lords. You know, they're
So we have one last question from Elizabeth Hanson of English.
Hi, I'm wondering how the modernization of the Elizabethan military played into this, because I mean that's one way that Elizabeth offset the power of the nobility, right? Was having an increasingly professional military.
oh yeah, and
You know, that helped her out in America, and may have differentiated what happened in America from Ireland. I don't know. It's just, you know, a factor you haven't talked about.
Well, I think actually that if you look at the English military in Ireland, that they are not nobility. It's ruled by captains.
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah.
What I mean,
It's the captains, and that's what Raleigh was. He was a captain. And there are dozens of them, and these are the people who have the power throughout Ireland. So they're military men. They tend to be gentry. Very rarely would you have a peer of the realm involved, except as at the very top. You know, like when Essex is sent over at the end of the 16th century. And those are the people interested in colonizing. And one of the things I argue in the book, colonization is done by the courtiers. These are the people who were captains, basically. If you look at in Ireland, if you look at America, it's the captains. The captain's the key official. And in fact, Walsingham in England approved every single captain while he was alive. So it's a way that at the center of government, they keep control. But what fascinated me, you've got captains all over the place, and the number 2 man in power knows every single captain. No one gets assigned unless he approves it. And these are the gentry. These are people, and they're going to be raised to, you know, become sir. You know, so they are going to be knighted, but they all don't begin knighted for sure. So I think this is what's taking place, you know, at this time is, of course, the rise of the bourgeoisie. You know, the merchant class and people like Raleigh and his family, they're so heavily involved in overseas trade and expansion, and they're resented by so many in the peerage. You know, when you think of Drake, Granville, Raleigh, the Gilberts, they all come from one part of England, Devonshire area, the southwest, and these are people on the rise. They come from good families, but they're not lords and barons. And they are pushing for political power. Yeah.
I have a question just about your use of the word conquest and just that,
Hmm?
like that concept. I noticed like you obviously you used it throughout your presentation, but I didn't really, I don't know if I just missed that you like problematize this concept just because like when you describe colonization, it seems to be like something that is happening in terms of what's understood in England as what's happening.
Oh, yeah.
And then like, you know, when you describe like the actual process and how it's imagined and like the policies that are created, it seemed like um, it's something that's meant to like as an attempt to control, like, you know, we're going to do this so that we can try and like stop everybody from being nomads. It feels like they're going out and doing this project but not really understanding or like not really having full control over the situation on the ground. But then also just this question just comes from my own understandings of like colonization as a project, like a process of collaboration, which like locals do have to, like it only works if locals collaborate with, or it rests on the collaboration of locals with the people who are, I guess, leading the project of conquest. And I'm just wondering, like, if you talk about that, or if you consider that aspect of colonization, or if it's just like, I guess, outside the scope of your project.
No, I am exactly interested, although not as much in this project, but I actually do a whole lot on the Irish and colonization. I just didn't talk about it today. But I do believe in that actual model of colonization on the ground. But to go back to the original part of the question, conquest was in their mind specifically as a form of colonization. And they looked at the Spanish as, oh, that's what they've done in America. They've used conquest. So that was one of the methods they could use, would be conquest. But Raleigh's idea was not conquest. For instance, in America, he wants to have an integrated society. He doesn't define exactly how, but it's clear the Indians, the colonized, you know, the people who live there, the indigenous, and the English are going to live together. So that's not a conquest model. But, you know, the Peckham's model is conquest. You know, specifically, you go in well armed, you build forts, they will assent, or else. You know, it's clearly, and they do use the word conquest. But so I think there's different ways people are looking at it. But on the ground, English colonization winds up to be a large amount of how do you work with indigenous peoples. And conquest comes along, but I don't think it's the main thrust of colonization.